The boats, the last resort of the terror-stricken passengers, were unshipped from the davits, but 4 or 5, all except 2, were swamped. The captain and his crew and about 30 passengers got into these. The remainder, numbering little less than 200 souls, being left, from terrible necessity, to their fate. The Hobart Courier, September 22nd, 1853. The captain of the William and Mary told everyone that, tragically, these 170 or so passengers must have gone down with his ship. News of the tragedy traveled all around the world. It took longer for the news of these lost passengers landing in the Bahamas to arrive, though they had a very interesting story to tell.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story? The Outrage of William and Mary.
Here we are. Enjoy!
The 500-ton American ship William and Mary had been built in Bowdenham, Maine, and the 3-masted Barque was under the command of a man from the same place by the name of Captain Stinson. Though the William and Mary was only a year old, she had already gained a reputation as a fast sailor, and this attracted immigrants to take passage on her. Not that the people seeking to travel from Europe across the Atlantic could afford to be very picky about their transportation. From June to December of 1852, 221,068 immigrants had departed from Liverpool to be taken on board the thousands of ships that were in the harbor, waiting to take them all over the world. By March of 1853, ships to carry immigrants were already in great demand. When the William and Mary left Liverpool on the 23rd of March, 1853, she had 208 passengers on board, all people immigrating to America. There were 86 people who were traveling as a group from Friesland in the Netherlands, 12 German passengers, and the remainder were English and Irish. In addition to all these people came their luggage and supplies for the voyage, and the William and Mary was also loaded with a cargo of railway iron. Their planned destination was New Orleans. The first 2 months of the voyage were not a particularly pleasant one for the passengers. But it was also not more unpleasant than any other voyage on one of the overcrowded immigrant ships of the era. The crew felt that the provisions for the voyage were not being properly distributed, but they did not have much recourse. 2 babies were born. 14 passengers passed away from sickness. It was noted that Captain Stinson did show some care for the sick, but he was hampered by a complete lack of medical knowledge. In the place of medical knowledge, he carried a small book that, apparently, advised the feeding of ham to anyone who had a fever. It was still true that none of this was enjoyable for the passengers, but it was at least within the expectations for travel at the time. On May 2nd, it was discovered that the William and Mary had traveled too far south to enter the New Bahama Channel, and on the 3rd of May, Captain Stinson made a decision that would be called into question even before the entire story was known. He decided to enter the Northwest Providence Channel in a very unfavorable condition, with a strong wind coming from the southeast and choppy seas. As Captain Stinson steered towards Stirrup Key, the weather grew even worse. Captain Stinson had made a terrible error, though. At sunset, he had not been able to see the keys, possibly due to the hazy weather, and he had assumed that they were northwest of the Great Isaacs. He therefore kept his ship heading west by south. Captain Stinson proved entirely incorrect about where his ship was and around 9 that night, the William and Mary violently struck the Isaac rocks amidships with enough force to knock the people on board off of their feet and out of their chairs. For about 15 minutes, the ship hung, suspended on the rock, in only about 10 fathoms of water. With the waves as choppy as they were, the ship was pounded repeatedly against the rocks before finally coming free and swinging off, only to be thrown on another part of the reef a short distance away, striking almost exactly the same place on the ship. There was now a large hole in the ship's side, and no one was in any doubt that the ship was in a sinking condition. The anchors were dropped, and the pumps were put to work immediately, while the ship's boats were prepared to be launched in the morning. Many of the passengers, expecting the ship to sink beneath their feet at any moment, rushed to the boats. One of the boats was launched, but it was so overcrowded that the davits bent under the weight, so it could not be launched. Another boat was successfully launched, this one a longboat that could hold 100 people, but this boat was smashed into splinters on the hull of the ship. A third boat was launched, and some of the sailors and the ship's steersman got on board, while the captain ordered that provisions be brought up into the hold and loaded onto the boat, something Captain Stinson said was needed in order to preserve provisions from the rising water in the hold. At this point, there was no trust lost between Captain Stinson and the passengers, and even though Captain Stinson said that he would be the last to evacuate the ship, the passengers kept a close watch on him through the night to ensure that he did not abandon them. It was noted, though, that there was a shore in the distance. At no point did Captain Stinson decide to signal their ship's distress in the hopes of rescue. Through the night, the passengers worked the pumps, but it was a losing battle. Around midnight, there was 4 feet of water in the hold of the ship. At 4 in the morning, the weather had grown even more stormy, and the water in the hold had doubled, even though both pumps were still going. By 7 a.m., there were 10 feet in the hold, and the ship had started to sink. With this, another longboat was launched, and the passengers rushed to board it. In the rush, 2 passengers were lost to the waves. In total, 30 of the passengers escaped from the William and Mary in the longboat. As the passengers were distracted with the launching of this boat, Captain Stinson took his chance and boarded the boat that had already been loaded with provisions and cast off from the ship, abandoning all those on board. As many as 4 sailors seem to have remained on board the William and Mary. Accounts are somewhat confusing, but if it was that many, only 2 remained willingly. William Ward and Samuel Harris, 2 of the sailors, refused to leave the ship with the others and abandon the passengers, and instead chose to stay. If there were indeed 2 other sailors on board of the ship, as some of the passengers said, they had been abandoned by the captain, rather than choosing to remain, and there were allegations of drunken cruelty from them by the passengers who were stranded on the sinking ship. Now that they were left without any boats to escape on, they had to determine what it was possible for them to do. William Ward and Samuel Harris would later voice their opinion that the ship could have been grounded safely so that everyone could escape, since the land was only 8 miles away, if Captain Stinson and the crew had remained. With most of the crew gone, however, and the passengers not able to do much more than frantically pump to keep the ship afloat, the William and Mary simply drifted to the northeast, without any sort of plan or destination. While the passengers were in this precarious position, Captain Stinson was being rescued mere hours after having abandoned his ship. His boat and the boat full of passengers were separated. Captain Stinson and his men were picked up by the brig the Reuben Carver, while the boat with the passengers was also picked up by another ship while in sight of the Reuben Carver. Captain Stinson assured Captain Cobb of the Reuben Carver that the William and Mary had sank only minutes after they had left her, with all 170 passengers who were still on board. While there was no wreckage to be seen, no one had any reason to doubt the truth of the statement, and all over the world, newspapers mourned the tragedy that had claimed so many lives. From the start, there were questions, though. Why was it that Captain Stinson had struck such a well-charted obstacle? Why had he chosen to take a passage that was so poorly suited to his vessel and in such poor conditions? And why was it that all of the crew was in one lifeboat, with very few members of the crew in the lifeboat with the passengers? These were questions that Captain Stinson was able to ignore for the most part, though. He and his men had been through a terrible experience, and had been forced to do what they could to save their lives. When the ship had gone down, they had been able to save next to nothing, and were objects of charity. No one thought to go looking for the wreck of the William and Mary to see if there were any survivors. They were sure that there were not. Meanwhile, the passengers had managed to keep the William and Mary afloat yet through constant efforts at the pumps, in spite of losing ground slowly against the water. On the night of the 4th, the same day that those on board had been left without boats, they began to construct rafts from pieces of the ship for their eventual need to evacuate the ship. But they did not launch them, waiting until the next morning. The next morning, land came in sight again, this time about 10 miles distant, and they did what Captain Stinson had failed to do on the night of the wreck. They raised a flag at half-mast as a sign of distress. They also began to fire guns in the hope of calling attention to themselves. Almost as soon as the distress flag was raised, a schooner appeared and immediately changed course to come alongside them. The ship proved to be the Oracle, a wrecking ship under the command of Captain Robert Sands of the Bahamas. With rescue so close to the passengers, who were exhausted by the past couple of days, found a second wind and redoubled their efforts on the pumps. The main challenge to the evacuation of the William and Mary was the size of the Oracle, which was far too small to take everyone off at once. Captain Sands and his small crew of 6 men decided that the best thing to do was to remove the women and children first, and then come back for the rest. The whole day, the Oracle circled the sinking barque, bringing them off the ship and then rowing them to shore in small boats, while a small number of people remained on the ship pumping to keep her afloat for as long as possible. Through an incredible level of effort on the part of the crew of the Oracle, when the William and Mary did finally sink on the 6th of May, only 2 men were still on board of her, having been manning the pumps. Both men were able to jump free from the ship as she went down, and the Oracle picked them up as well. Through the entire ordeal, only 2 lives had been lost, a far cry from the 170 that was being announced around the world. For the nights of the 6th and the 7th, the passengers were forced to camp out. Very little had been saved from the ship other than what they were wearing, but the locals were kind and provided their unexpected guests with food, though they could not offer shelter to all of them. Word, meanwhile, was sent to Nassau about what had happened, and ships were made available to transport the immigrants to Nassau, where they arrived on the 13th of May. The company that owned the William and Mary paid for their stay in Nassau, while ships were arranged to bring them to New Orleans, as had originally been intended. In Nassau, the passengers from the William and Mary were again met with kindness, with the city rallying together to provide them with clothing. In addition, as the shipwreck victims left the city, they were each provided with $1. It was not a small gesture to those who had lost everything. In New Orleans, the arrival of the survivors from the William and Mary was anticipated, and everything was already arranged for them. The British consul in New Orleans issued an appeal to the public asking for a fund to be arranged for whatever they might need, and for help arranging passage for them to their final destinations. Soon after arriving, with the aid of the German Society, the Dutch passengers were able to board a ship headed for St. Louis. Much of this was funded by the company that owned the William and Mary, who had stepped up to honor their contract with the passengers to provide them with complete passage to that city. Between these passengers, $440, which had been raised from the citizens of New Orleans, was also distributed to help them start a new life. The remainder of the passengers, who were bound for destinations further west, spent longer in the city while transportation was arranged for them, the entire time supported by the city and treated with kindness. Some of them were too ill after the ordeal to travel immediately in any case, even if a ship had been available to take them. One of the sailors who had abandoned the William and Mary with Captain Stinson was found by the newspapers, and admitted that he was still haunted by the vision of all the people who had screamed to him for help and the anguish on their faces as they had rowed away. The news that they were still alive was a relief, but it did not change his guilt. Captain Stinson never issued such a statement, and his feelings on the whole matter are unknown. Many people believe that the ship going down with those on board was his most sincere wish, since it would have meant that he would not have to face the public scrutiny of any of his actions. In sharp contrast was the actions of Captain Sands of the Oracle, who exerted himself to the utmost to save every life. He was awarded a silver life-saving medal, as well as a monetary award for the bravery of himself and his men. At the award ceremony, he spoke modestly, saying that he was happy that he could help the poor reputation of those who worked in the wrecking industry in such a way, and that he had simply acted on the values that had been instilled in him by his parents.
For more information, please see the Sailor's Magazine from July 1853, or see our other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.